A couple of years ago, I recorded what I said would be my only video on actually making the sourdough, but my methods have changed and improved since then, and I thought I would share them with you. So grab a beverage of choice and let's bake some sourdough together. Thank you for being here. I'm Nancy Ann. I'm really honored that you're choosing a little bit of time to spend with me. If you are planning on using this as kind of a step-by-step, do the first part, pause, come back to it, for making sourdough literally right along with me, I would suggest that you go ahead and watch the video all the way through first, just so that you know what you need in the way of ingredients and tools you might want. Speaking of tools, I do use a lot of tools when I make sourdough. I've been accumulating these over the past 7 or so years since I started making sourdough, and they're not all necessary. I think the things that are most necessary are a scale that will weigh in grams. If you do not weigh your sourdough and you use imperial measurements like we do here in the US, you're just not going to have as accurate results. Flour can weigh more in a cup. If you pack it tighter or not quite as much, you're just not going to get as consistent results, and it's going to be much more difficult for you to troubleshoot what might be going wrong. So I highly advise a scale. I also advise a bowl. Of course, you need a bowl. Literally, you could mix with your hands, so not even a spoon is necessary. But you will also need something to shape your dough in while it proofs. We'll get into that later. I use a banneton. You could do something as simple as just a smallish bowl and a loaf pan. So those things you will need for shaping. Again, we'll cover a little bit of that moving forward. The links to all the tools that I'm using, in case you want any for yourself, affiliate links will be in the description box below, as well as pinned to the top of the comments as soon as I am able to do that after the video comes out. All right, let's get into baking some sourdough. So we're going to start off zeroing our bowl on the scale. So I'm going to turn the scale on. I'm going to put the bowl on there. Now I'm going to hit this button right here, which will zero it out. Try that again. There we go. And I'm going to put 200 grams of starter in it. Now, believe it or not, I fed this starter 5 days ago. You do not have to use fresh fed starter. Will it turn out a little bit better sourdough? Probably, but let's be real. Most of us need to save as much time as we can. So when I feed my starter, I feed it enough that I can just pull it straight out of the refrigerator and make a loaf next time, and I don't have to do a refeed right before I bake. Now, because it's winter, I'm going to use 200 grams of starter. And by the way, it was still doubled in there because it hasn't run out of nutrients yet, which tells me that it is still going to be very good for feeding my dough. So I'm 130 grams. 200 grams exactly, yay me. Now because it's winter, I'm doing 200 grams or 20%. All of your percentages go off of your total flour weight. So I will be using 1,000 grams of flour, and 20% of starter would be 200 grams of starter. If this were not winter and we're not cold out, I would be doing 15% or 150 grams. If it was getting a little bit warmer, and if it was quite a bit warmer, the heat of summer, I would either do 5 or 10% starter, which would be 50 or 100 grams. But because it is cold outside, I'm going to go with the full 200 grams. That's left in there, and I will feed that enough that I can make more sourdough later. Next in, I'm going to do water. Now I call this baby bath warm water, or baby bottle, where if you ran it over your wrist, you could feel it was wet, but not the temperature. Let me zero out my scale. Now I want to be at 75% hydration. That's working for me these days, but I have a little trick. I'm going to show you with the salt in a minute. So I'm going to do 725 grams instead of 750, which would be 75% hydration, because I'm going to hold 25 grams back to mix with my salt. I'll explain that in a second. That's a new thing I've started doing. I add my water first because I can pull it off easily if I get too much. Whoop, a little bit high. I am going to pull that off. 725, perfect. My starter is fed at 80% hydration just because that is closer to what I bake my bread at. You can do 100% hydration starter, which is when you do 1 part starter to 1 part water and 1 part flour when you feed it. But I do 80%. Again, I found that it helps a little bit with the results of my bread not necessary, but it does make it a little harder to mix. So I broke that up a little. I'm going to set this aside while I take care of my salt. So I'm going to set my little tiny vessel on there to mix the salt. I'm going to zero it out again. And now I'm going to add 25 grams of salt. This is 2.5%. I like my bread a little saltier than most people. I've never had anybody complain that my bread is too salty, but most people do 2%. I have been known to do it with 3% before, and that's fine too. And now I'm going to zero back out, and I'm going to add that last 25 grams of water right here. I'm going to take the same spoon that I was mixing everything else with, and I'm just going to give it a little stir to make sure it's starting to get a little dissolved in there. And now I'm going to bring my starter back in my water, and I'm just going to mix a little bit with the spoon, and then I'm going to come in with a whisk to break this up. Again, if your starter is 100% hydrated, you can skip this step. You'll be able to mix it with a spoon just fine, or if you have a liquid starter. But because mine's a little bit stiffer, I have to take an extra step here with the whisk. Okay, want to make sure that's mostly mixed. Let me get my spoon, make sure there's no big chunks. Nope, I think we're doing pretty good. I want that as evenly distributed as possible in my dough so that it evenly proofs. Now I'm going to come in with my flour. This time I'm using Bob's Red Mill organic whole wheat flour. I have a whole wheat starter as well. I use my whole wheat starter for everything. If I'm going to make a rye bread, I start with the whole wheat starter. Zero this out. Now I'm going to keep an eye on my measurements down there, and I'm put in 200 grams of flour. There we go. Perfect. That's the whole wheat flour. And then the remaining 800 grams to bring me up to 1,000 grams of flour is going to be King Arthur organic bread flour. Now just use whatever bread flour you have and whatever whole wheat flour. I do think I get best results using King Arthur or Bob's Red Mill. I do it according to price. Also, I have recently been diagnosed with leukemia, and so I'm trying to keep all of the chemicals I can out of my body, and that's why all the organic, but it's not necessary. These are both high quality flours regardless, but you go with whatever is available to you and works for you. But bread flour is really good because it's a high protein content, so you're much more likely to get a good crumb. And I'm going to bring this up to where it says 1,000 because we already had 200 grams of whole wheat flour in there. I backed it up so you could see I'm at 1,000 grams total weight flour. And now I'm just going to stir everything. Start out with my spoon. So now that my water is no longer pooling, it's mixed in to some degree where it's not big wet pools in my dough, I'm gonna get in here with my rubber scraper. And all I'm trying right now is make it evenly moist. The reason I didn't put the salt in at the beginning is because I have learned that when I put the salt in with this, my crumb winds up being just a little bit tighter. I think it absorbs the water better initially during fermentolyse, which I'm going to talk about in just a second, if the salt's not in there. If you want to save time, you don't want to mix that salt in later, just add it at the beginning. It won't be that big of a difference. This is just a little something that I do that seems to help the crumb on my finished product. I am going to get my hands wet and put them in here just to make sure there's no dry patches. And I think I'm really good. So I want to show you something if you've never seen this before. I'm going to try and pull this up. Now a window pane is when you can pull a little section of the dough up and you can see light through it, but you can see that's hopeless. This is just really shaggy, falling apart. So I'm going to let this sit for an hour and then we'll be back and add our salt and I'll show you the miraculous thing that occurs when you just leave the flour and the water sitting for an hour. I messed up. I added my salted water after a half an hour of this sitting alone and mixed it in, and I thought I was recording and I wasn't, so you're going to have to take my word for it. But I do want to show you, after sitting for even half an hour, I now have more of like a window pane. It's not as good as it was because I've been kneading it, but you could see light through it when I held it up. So what I did was I just dumped the water with the salt in, and then I took a piece of dough and I wiped it around like this to make sure I got all the salt, because I'm just like that. And then I kneaded to get it in evenly. And that kneading serves two purposes. Number one, it's helping to mix the salt evenly. And number two, it's also developing some gluten. Now, it was quite watery. There was water going around, and I just continued working it in. And now we're up to a full 75% hydration. So the kneading for me helps. I'm not someone who tries to get bread that has the great big holes. It's beautiful. I've done that a few times where they develop super strong gluten and get plenty of hydration in there. But here's what I found. If you're making a sandwich and spreading mayonnaise, you're getting it on your hands. Butter on your hands. Same thing with jelly. If you are just going to eat the bread plain, or maybe put a piece of cheese on it or something, that works. Otherwise, for everyday use, those big, beautiful Instagram-worthy loaves with the huge holes, they're not practical. The rest of us, we just want to be able to eat a delicious loaf of sourdough. This does help when I add the salt afterwards to help improve an open crumb, but I'm still not going in for that super big open crumb, which is why I'm not going in for a super high hydration. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and cover this up again. We're going to let it sit for about 15 minutes because today, again, I am tighter on time than I realized. It only Autolyse, by the way, Fermentolise is when the starter is in there. Autolyse is when you let it sit, the flour and water, without the starter in it. But it only Fermentolise for half an hour, and it still had a beautiful window pane and was just fine. So instead of my normal half an hour of letting the gluten relax so we can do stretch and folds, I'm just going to give it 15 minutes and we'll come back and see how it's doing. It's time for our first set of either stretch and folds or coil folds, depending on how the dough feels. I've wet my hands so that they don't stick to the dough, and I'm going to give it a feel. So this is, I think stretch and folds will work. If it's really loose, I'll do coil folds, because you can only keep stretching for so far before you're out of the bowl. I'm going to do 3 to 4 sets of these, depending on how the dough is responding, and they will be 15 minutes apart. Now, normally, again, they are 30 minutes apart, but in this case, I'm in a hurry. Now, as you saw, I started on one side, I hit it all 4 sides, then I came through and I hit the corners. I think that kind of helps me to get double bang for my buck and not have to come back as often to stretch and fold. Okay, we'll be back in another 15 minutes. It's time for our second set of stretch and folds. Get my hands wet again. So again, I'm going to hit it on 4 sides, pull it up and over, just until it kind of starts resisting me. Oh, I like the way this is feeling. Yeah, it's not real loose. Of course, if I would have let it sit another 15 minutes like I normally do for 30 instead of 15, I probably would be working with a more spread out dough. But sometimes you just got to make the dough work around your own schedule. So hitting the last corner here. All right, we're going to cover it up and let it set 15 more minutes for one more set of stretch and folds. Last set of stretch and folds. Get my hand wet again. Get each one of 4 sides. Oh, that's feeling good. It's nice and bouncy. Feels like it's getting some air in it. The gluten feels good and developed. Again, had I let it rest an extra 15 minutes each time, probably would have spread out even more, but I think we're doing okay, all things considered. And look, you got to make sourdough work around your life, not the other way around. Maybe you'll have a little bit of compromised results, but it's still going to be better than anything you buy in the store. Okay, so I'm going to be proofing my bread in this Cambro container. But if you don't have something like that, if you just find something that has a straight side, whether you're putting all of the dough into a big container with straight sides similar to this, or you're just getting a little sample like this, you can put it down in here. This isn't super accurate, but it's good enough. I'll kind of get it level. And now I'm going to take a dry erase pen. I'm going to put it here, mark it like that. And then if it's doubled, then, well, actually 3/4 is what I do. About 3/4 of the way up, then you know it's proofed enough. So I just cover this and I set it right next to my dough while it's proofed. But because I have this, I'm not going to leave it in the bowl like I used to. I'm just going to pick this up and I'm going to drop my dough down in here as gently as possible because I don't want to knock too much air out of it. Kind of tuck the sides just a little bit. Now I know that with my 1,000 gram balls of dough, I usually come up to right about 2 liters on the mark. We're a little bit lower this time. I'm not sure why that is, but I'm going to take a look at it. And I go with where the dough peaks. So the dough is peaking at about 2 liters, which means I'm going to want to go up to 3.5 liters here in rising. I like it to rise about 75% before I shape and then fridge proof. So we will be back when this dough has risen 75%. Let me cover it up. I'm going to cover it with the same cheap shower cap I did before. I could put the lid to the Cambro on it, but what I found is the dough bumps into it when it rises, and then it kind of tears a little bit, and that can mess up a few of the bubbles inside, which we don't want to do. So I'll be back when this dough has risen up 75% to the 3.5 liter line. I'm popping back in real quick. First of all, a lot of people wonder why this is called bulk proof. It's called bulk proof. It's because when the bulk of your dough before it gets divided up proofs at room temperature. Also, this is how I cover my little sample. I just take a plastic bag and I put a rubber band around it. And I sit it right down next to this while it rises if I do not have a container that already has markings on the side. One thing to note, I do put this in as warm a place as I can find this time of year. Right now, this is the microwave that's over my stove. The lights underneath are shining down onto the stovetop, and that warms the microwave a little bit. We've never turned it on, but that does help me to get the dough proofed in an acceptable period of time, so I'm not doing this after bed. But you just do the best you can. It'll be a slower rise if you do it at a lower temperature, but that's okay. I'm just trying to speed it up to fit into my day. Again, sourdough should fit around you, not the other way around. So my dough has risen about 75% from the 2 liter mark up to the 3.5 liter mark. Now it is at that spot at the peak, at the top of the dough where it's mounded up, not where it's clinging to the sides, because that's how it was when it was down at the 2 liter mark. Also, our little sample jar, there was the original mark. That was where the peak was. Now the peak is up a little bit higher. You can tell this isn't quite as accurate because it's such a small sample, but at least gives you some sort of gauge if you want to find a little something instead of just strictly eyeballing. I am going to tilt this out onto the counter now. I just give it a little pull, and a lot of times then it will, just urging it out a little bit, it will dump out on its own and release from the sides. People have said you do not use any flour on your counter. No, if this is properly proofed, it should pretty much, well, it shouldn't stick at all. You should be able to push it around just fine. I'm going to eyeball it to cut it in half. This is my bench scraper. It does have measurements there if you want to use it to measure something. I just like this because it has enough of an edge to cut, but it does not ruin my countertop. Sometimes I will measure the weight to cut it in half, but most of the time I just do it just like that. That's pretty good. I think this side may be a little bit bigger than that side. Yeah, I'll cut a little hunk off here, add it to this side. So this is just a rough shape. It's called a pre-shape. And all this is, I didn't used to do this at all when I cut it in half. I just go straight to final shape and put it in my Banneton. But what I didn't realize, and I believe it was Soon on Food Geek who pointed this out, that when you cut through like this and right there, you're cutting those gluten strands. So by letting the dough rest another 30 minutes, you're giving it an opportunity to heal the gluten strands, and that's going to give you a nicer crumb structure because it's going to strengthen that gluten inside the dough. The other thing it does is it kind of gives you a little bit more of an opportunity to develop some gluten strength. So I just folded it in very roughly on itself. Now I'm using a twisting motion. My hand is actually pushing down on the counter as I bring the dough around. So I'm going to set this aside, but I'm going to put my little shower cap on it. And now I'm just going to pre-shape this, just folding all those edges kind of in. Just kind of tucking it around. Flip it over so that the uncut sides, the part that isn't stuck together, is up. I'm just going to bring it around a few times until it looks pretty smooth on top. I'm going to set this here. I'm going to set this here. And I'm just going to take my container. If you proofed it in a bowl, you can use that. And I think I'm going to put it right like that. And I'm going to let these rest for about half an hour. You know, I changed my mind. I'm going to take that off because it's a little crowded in there and I want plenty of room for the gluten to relax, and I'm just going to put this bowl over top. Okay, now I'll see you in half an hour. It has been 30 minutes. Now we are going to shape, final shape. Our loaves, I'm going to move this one aside while I shape this one, and I turn it over. Get my banneton close at hand. I think I will make this one the boule. And I don't want to really flatten it out a ton. With sourdough, this isn't like yeast dough where you want to punch it down. You want to keep it airy because you don't want to lose those air holes. While it sits in the fridge, it's not going to completely flatten down, and that will also help you have a lighter crumb when you go to bake. So I'm going to do one fold over this way, one fold slightly over that way, and now I'm going to take it this way and I'm just going to roll it. Now this is for a boule. There's more than one way to skin a cat. This isn't the only way to shape a boule. It's one of a couple different ways. It's just what I'm doing for right now. Just until we have a nice tight surface. Gives a little more gluten development. And now I'm going to take it, flip it over, put it in here. I am going to do a little bit of what they call stitching in the middle here, although truthfully it's probably not going to hold. I don't like to do too tight of a squeeze here on the bottom. I found that when my dough bakes, it can be kind of heavy on the bottom, dense and compacted. So I'm just going to do it just like that. And then for this one, I'm just going to take a bowl and put that over top to put in the fridge, but I'm going to leave it sitting at room temp for a little bit. I'll explain that in a minute. And now I'm going to go with my batard, which is going to be shaped into a loaf. We're going to make a loaf of sandwich dough. So again, I'm going to start out the same way, trying not to lose my loft. I'm just going to take this, fold it to the middle, fold it to the middle, and then I'm going to go like this. They call that a caddy clasp, but I'm just going to squeeze it in the middle there, like that, squeezing out those huge bubbles. Now this one is going to be flipped upside down, so the bottom side is down instead of top side, because I'm going to put this in the dish exactly the same way that it's going to bake. And I have greased this. I used avocado oil. Use whatever you have. I'm going to put it right here in the loaf pan and let it sit like that. I'm going to take the same shower cap I've been using the whole time. I'm going to put it over top. Now I'm going to let both of these sit for at least half an hour because I stopped the bulk proofing at 75%, and really you want it closer to double when it goes in the oven. I was doing my shaping and stuff during some of that time, so now I'm going to let it sit for another 30 minutes just to give it a chance to proof a little bit more, get a little bit close to what would have been that doubling time, and then I'm going to put it in the refrigerator overnight. I'll see you in the morning. By the way, that overnight proof in the refrigerator is mostly to develop flavor. If you wanted to, you could put this in the freezer for about 45 minutes right now to make it easier to score, then score it and bake it right away. But because I like more of that developed sourdough flavor, I like the tang, I'm going to put mine in the refrigerator overnight. Good morning. It is about 16 hours later. This has been fridge proofing for quite a while. By the way, bulk proof yesterday was about 5.5 hours, and I have a strong suspicion this is going to be underproofed. It's just my gut. I feel like it should have sat at bulk proof for longer, or I should have let it sit in the bannetons after it was shaped for longer. But we are where we are, and it will still be delicious. I am going to do just a little bit of scoring on this, our loaf pan. Just let that soak in a little bit because I am going to use some white rice powder in my dredger here. Now this is not necessary. You could just do a split down the middle and then go ahead and bake it. It'd be fine. But because I'm me and because this is a scoring channel, I'm going to go ahead and do a little bit of scoring on this loaf. So I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to use my doily. Now I'll put my videos that do the original more detailed scores of these at the end, clickable thumbnails on the end screen. We're just going to do this because this is pretty quick. People asked me where I got this. I got it at an antique store. So if you want to get something for yourself, just make sure that there's plenty of open space for your rice flour to go through and make your design. So I'm just going to get that down nice and firm. Do some sprinkling here with my rice flour. Okay, so now I'm going to carefully lift this up because I want to keep as little as possible from falling where the pattern shouldn't be. And now I'm going to do one score right down the middle, and I'm going to do it straight down. I'm not scoring for an ear. The reason is this is a sandwich loaf, and I don't want that big ear poking up. That just makes it really hard to cut and bite into for your sandwiches, especially when there's two of them close together when you put two pieces of bread together. So I'm going to go straight down just to get it to kind of do an even split without one big sharp edge sticking up. So. And this pattern makes it easy to go right down the middle. I'm just going to go as deeply as I can, all the way down the middle. Run through one more time. Okay. I'm going to put this on my bread sling. I've mentioned this in all of my videos. I love my bread sling. It goes right down into my Dutch oven, and these handles are long enough that I can tuck them into the handles of the Dutch oven. I have quite a deep Dutch oven. But I'm going to put it on the bread sling, my loaf, and I'm actually going to lift this whole thing up, and I'm going to set it down in the Dutch oven, and then I'm going to put the cold lid on. Now my Dutch oven, the base has been heating for over an hour to 500 degrees to make sure that all of that cast iron in my Dutch oven is nice and hot. As soon as I put the lid on and slide it into the oven, I'm going to turn my temperature down to 425 degrees, and I'm going to bake this for 40 minutes. I'll be back with the par bake. Before we take the lid off of our loaf pan that has been baking inside the Dutch oven for the past 40 minutes, I did want to mention the reason why I put a cold lid. I don't heat the lid up with the Dutch oven in the oven before I bake. It's because when I used to put the hot lid on, it seemed to affect the oven spring. Putting a cold lid on doesn't form that crust to form on top so much, which can hold back your oven spring. So when I put a cold lid on, it has a little bit more time, just a little bit more to expand and maybe get better oven spring. Okay, you're ready to take a look and see how our score turned out. Puff of steam. Oh, wow, that's awesome oven spring. It's not a smooth belly, but I'm okay with that. It's a sandwich loaf after all. Our scoring looks beautiful on the sides. And then it doesn't have a smooth belly, but that's okay. We're just going to slice it into sandwiches anyway. But wow, did that ever get awesome oven spring? What do you think? Okay, now this is going to be set aside. I'm going to put the Dutch oven back in the oven, let it heat back up to 500 degrees, and we are going to score our boule. Let's get to scoring my boule. Now this one has been sitting in the refrigerator, of course, longer than the loaf pan. The reason why I decided to do this one second is because the loaf pan is held up by the pan itself, whereas this, a little bit more time in the fridge isn't going to hurt anything by helping it develop a little more stability, because the colder the loaf is, the more stable. This score I'm about to do is my most popular video. By and far the most views. I'll link that at the end too. I won't go into as much description this time because we want to get this in the oven and I don't want this video to be ridiculously long. And I'm going to be working with black cocoa powder this time instead of the white cocoa or the rice flour that I did in the original video with this score. This is a go-to score for me. It's real quick, it's easy, turns out a pretty result. I love doing the more intricate scores, but sometimes I just want to slap something out there quick. And it's really hard for me not to do some sort of decorative scoring on a loaf, just because I think that's so much fun. So this is the black cocoa powder brand here, also linked down in the description box. This stuff is expensive. Thankfully, you don't need to use a lot at one time. I will say it also makes really nice brownies, very dark. Okay, let me brush the excess cocoa powder off of this and I'll be right back. There we go. That helps it not to make such a big mess in the oven. By the way, people have asked, does the cocoa powder have any flavor? No, it doesn't on the bread, but it does smell divine when it's baking. So I'm just going to get right over my loaf here and divide this into as close as I can, 4 equal sections with my handy dandy dental floss. And then I'm going to make 4 other marks because that's where my wheat stalks are going to go. So now I'm going to do my wheat stalks first, just so that everything doesn't start splitting with the main score. So just a little mark at the top, and then you just go straight down like this. I'm going to go kind of deep on these because I want the wheat stalks to really show up and split nicely. And now I'm going to do my main score. So these are my functional scores. This is where I want it to divide the most in the oven. Nice and deep on these. I'm going down from the center instead of straight across because I found that it kind of pulls at the dough surface a little bit and can make it look a little wrinkly. And I love doing this crossways score on boules because of the direction of tension, which goes evenly around. It really helps them to lift off nicely. Do one more slice just to make sure we got it real good. Alrighty, this is going to go into my Dutch oven for 20 minutes. At 500, it's heated to 500, but as soon as it goes inside the oven with the cool lid, I will lower that temperature once again to 425 degrees and bake it for 40 minutes. Let's take a look at how our little 4 wheat stalk score turned out on the boule. There's that puff of steam. Oh, it's pretty. That turned out really nice. Yeah, I'm happy. The wheat stalks are beautiful. That's why I cut them kind of deep, because they open up nice and wide like that. Those are gorgeous. So these are going to go back in the oven. Normally, I would not be doing a loaf pan. Usually I do either boules or batards, and I bake one at a time in the Dutch oven. And then they both go onto a cookie sheet together and bake an additional 20 minutes. But because one of them is in a loaf pan, I can just put that straight on the oven rack, and then I can put this pan straight on the oven rack. And they're both going to bake an additional 20 minutes. At this point, these are mostly baked, if not entirely. The reason why they're going in longer is to brown. I have found that when I took these loaves that are roughly 500 grams of flour a piece and I baked them for less time, I started out doing 20 minutes, they just weren't baked enough. I was having a problem with the bottom of them being gooey and kind of gummy, and I just wasn't baking them long enough. So bigger loaves are going to need to bake longer. Reduce your bake time accordingly if your loaves are smaller than mine. Alrighty, I'm going to pop these in the oven for another 20 minutes and we'll be back with the final bake. I just got these out of the oven. They're still very hot. So this is as brown as I like them. I know I can leave them in for 20 minutes because I like to get my loaves fairly brown in the middle. You can leave them in longer or shorter depending on how browned you like your loaves. I think this turned out really pretty. So I'm going to wait until these have cooled enough to slice. It's ideal to wait until they're fully cool, and I will cut into this one. I'm going to give this one as a gift, but I'll cut into the loaf pan so we can get a look at the crumb. I'm going to wait just a little bit before removing it from the pan because it will stick and tear if I do it while it's too hot. So I'll be back with a crumb reveal. Well, this loaf is not quite all the way cool, but it is good enough. We're going to cut into it and get a good look at the crumb. Let's see how it turned out. Oh, that's pretty good, actually. I am happy with that. Let's see what we can do on cross-section here. We get a few different pieces. Well, there we go. That's our loaf. Take a taste. Very good. That good sourdough taste that happened from fermenting overnight in the refrigerator. This would be super awesome with some butter. Nice soft texture, nice crispy crust. Yeah, overall I'm really happy with this loaf. Well, I hope you enjoyed doing this with me. Let me know if you try this. Let me know what you think of the video. I love interacting with you guys, and we'll see you on the next one. Thank you very much for watching. If you found this video enjoyable, helpful, informative, any of those good things, please do squish the like button. Helps it so much. Also, hit that subscribe button. That tells me that I should continue making content for this channel.